I'm Professor Fred Rivara. I'm a pediatrician at the University of Washington, editor of Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine. It's a real pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. A.Moreno, who's a pediatrician and adolescent medicine specialist at the University of Washington and one of the world's experts on social networking. And she'll be talking today about social networking in health and adolescence. Megan?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be among you today. I'm going to be speaking about social networking sites and adolescent health. To begin with, I have no disclosures. And some of my objectives for our talk today are to help discuss and to help you to understand the popularity of social media, especially social networking sites, in the lives of today's adolescents, to discuss some of the health behaviors that adolescents display on these sites and what those health behaviors might mean both to the adolescents who display them as well as to other adolescents who view them. And finally, to consider what are the opportunities that these sites might present to us as pediatricians in working to improve the health of adolescents. And as we discuss today, I'd like to ask you to consider what we discuss in the context of how can we understand and utilize adolescents' displayed information on social media to improve adolescent health on a global scale. As I mentioned, I'm an adolescent medicine physician, and I became interested in this topic after my patients kept coming to me with questions and concerns and stories about what they had seen on various social networking sites. But before we can start to consider the health implications, I think it's helpful to ground ourselves in really what social media is and what it means. And the definition of social media is internet-based applications that allow the creation and exchange of user-generated content. That's a helpful starting place. It can be a little overwhelming when you consider the social media landscape. That includes publishing websites, sharing websites, photograph sharing websites, social media, blogging. There's so many of them, and sometimes it's difficult to understand how they differ from traditional media. When we consider traditional media, things such as television and radio, we consider this scene where the children are sitting down next to the television set, the mom is turning on the television set, and essentially all those children's job is to take those messages in. So in traditional media, there's a company or a corporation that creates the media, creates that message, and sends it out. And all our job is to do as consumers is to take that message in. What's so fundamentally different about social media is that that message is no longer created only by corporations or businesses. That message could be created by you, it could be created by me, it could be created by an 11-year-old girl. And those messages are going out and impacting what other people create. The way that the messages are created and shared is so fundamentally different, and that makes a difference in terms of how influential and how widespread those messages are. When we consider Facebook the most popular social networking site to date, and we think about the different pieces of Facebook that allow it to spread those messages and spread that information, we see within Facebook you can create a personal web profile. That's essentially your place, your platform to build what part of your identity you choose to share with the world. It also includes some tools to communicate with others on the site. You can email, you can have private conversations, you can have instantaneous conversations, and you can also publicly display your conversations, your comments, and your thoughts. And even more remarkable, it allows you to network within the site in a very public way. You can publicly disclose your connections, who you're friends with, who you want to talk with. And at the adolescent level, that's so critical because peer networks are so important to them. So when we think about how popular these sites are, this is slightly old data that suggests that about 3/4 of younger teens under 18 are on these sites, and about 90 to 95% of older adolescents in the college age range are on these sites. And these sites are only becoming more pervasive as mobile platforms allow adolescents instantaneous access throughout the day. When I drive or bike through our campus, I'm amazed at how many students you see walking down the street that are just constantly on their phones and checking Facebook and checking email. When we think about adolescent development, it also helps us to understand why these sites are so popular. Some of the major tasks of adolescent development include getting that intense peer group involvement, exploring your identity, as well as building a sense of independence. And from what I showed you of the components of Facebook, it really allows you to pursue all of those developmental tasks almost simultaneously. There are many benefits as well as risks to these sites. The benefits include being exposed to new viewpoints, being able to look outside of what your small town or your school may offer you. These sites are open access. There's no cost barrier. Everyone is allowed in. What I hear from my patients sometimes is that these sites are a great safe haven for kids that are the outcasts or the weird kids. And it allows kids to maintain long-distance friendships if they move or if they have friends that are other places in the globe or within their country. It also allows adolescents to participate civically, to organize events, to participate in political events. But there's also a downside to these sites. There's very little supervision by parents. When teens are on these sites, parents are generally not providing supervision. There's no moderator within the site that allows or watches over to make sure that the communication is safe. There's really no accountability for what one decides to display about themselves. These sites can be what we call a time sink. Adolescents will describe logging in and then realizing that 3 hours have gone by before they log out. And also these sites allow you to display personal information globally as well as permanently. And I think that's something to consider when we now start to discuss what types of health information teens voluntarily choose to disclose to us on these sites. In an early study, when we looked at the website MySpace, we looked at about 500 publicly available profiles, so anyone on the globe could have accessed these, of 18-year-olds. We found that about 41% of those profiles featured some type of substance use, most commonly alcohol, but also tobacco and drugs were featured on some of these profiles. Sexual behavior was publicly displayed on about a quarter of the sites. References to violence or aggression were present on about 14% of the sites. And if you were an adolescent that decided to display one of these behaviors, you were more likely to display others. So all told, about half the sites displayed one or more of these health risk behaviors. When we were viewing these behaviors, I'm giving you here some examples of some of the text references that we found. When we examined a similar sample on the website Facebook, we found that substance use went up somewhat to about 76%. Most of that was accounted for by an increase in alcohol displays to almost 3/4 of the profile. Tobacco and drugs were featured in similar proportions on the profiles. We were also interested in whether or not this was a venue where adolescents would discuss wanting to quit smoking or wanting to quit one of these behaviors, but I was very disappointed that my hypothesis was very, very incorrect, that this was a place where these types of hopes of wanting to quit were not frequently discussed. In this sample, we found about a quarter of the profiles, again, referenced sexual behavior. We also noticed that about a quarter of the profiles discuss symptoms and concerns about being depressed, and close to 10% discuss concerns about weight, most commonly concerns about being overweight or wanting to diet. These are some examples of the types of references we saw on Facebook. You can see personal picture references of people drinking alcohol. You can see the icon is something that's called a bumper sticker. It's a downloaded icon you can feature on your profile. And Facebook's also a fascinating venue because not only can you capture the text of what that profile owner wants to tell you, but you can also visualize what the response is from the other online friends, whether they support or whether they're negating what that person has displayed. So what does this displayed information mean? When an adolescent chooses to display this type of information, what's behind it? What does it mean? I think there's 3 possible considerations based on the media practice model. One is that if an adolescent displays a behavior, it might mean that they did the behavior. It also might mean that they're thinking about engaging in that behavior, and that Facebook or that social networking site is a trial ground where they can display references to that behavior and see what kind of feedback they get from their peers. It's also possible that these displays are nothing more than just bragging or boasting or just adolescent nonsense. We were interested in finding out what might be behind these profile displays, and for some of our early studies, we've focused on alcohol and depression. We've focused on these 2 mainly because they're so common in the adolescent population. Alcohol use is incredibly common among adolescents, but it's also one of the major causes of morbidity and mortality in this population. Depression is also one of the most common mental illnesses among the adolescent population, and both of these can be challenging to identify within the pediatrician's office. So we thought if we could find out what's behind these displays on Facebook, it might help us to better understand how to identify these within our offices as pediatricians. Within our study, we looked at public Facebook profiles, and we evaluated them for these references to alcohol use. They were then distributed into one of 3 categories. If there were no references to alcohol, they're a non-displayer. If there were references to alcohol, they were an alcohol displayer. And some examples would be going out for beers or a picture of that profile owner drinking a beer. But if they went beyond that, if they displayed references to either intoxication or problem drinking behaviors, which were linked to a problem drinking scale, then they were characterized as an intoxication or problem drinking displayer. And there's a couple examples up there. Examples would include blacking out, getting into trouble because of drinking, driving while drinking. Those would be considered problem drinking behaviors. So after these profiles were characterized into one of these 3 groups, all 3 groups, the non-displayers, alcohol displayers, and intoxication and problem drinking displayers, were given the audit, which is a clinical screen to evaluate for problem drinking behaviors and consequences. Then we compared those 3 groups and what their audit scores showed us. Within the Facebook profiles, about 64% of our profiles were non-displayers, about 20% were displayers, and 16% were intoxication or problem drinking displayers. And you can see by the graph here that the non-displayers scored the lowest on the problem drinking scale. The alcohol displayers scored slightly higher, but it was really only those adolescents who chose to publicly display intoxication or problem drinking that scored above that problem drinking threshold using that clinical screen. So from this, we could conclude that display of intoxication or problem drinking references on Facebook were associated with being more likely to be at risk for problem drinking. So what about depression? In another study, we evaluated Facebook profiles using the DSM criteria for a major depressive disorder. Non-displayers had no depression symptom references, and depression symptom references would include a statement that had to match one of those DSM criteria. So an example would be hopelessness might be characterized by Tom is so hopeless, can't stop the tears, or a reference to having depressed mood, Amy is too depressed to get out of bed this week. And similarly, we characterize the profiles as displayers or non-displayers. And in this study, both groups were given the PHQ-9 depression screen, and we compared those 2 groups by their PHQ-9 scores. Within the Facebook evaluation, we found that the majority of profiles, 67%, did not display references to depression, but 33% displayed symptoms that matched one of those depression diagnostic criteria. And you can see here that within both the mild, the moderate, and the severe category of the PHQ clinical screen, the depression displayers are more likely to score into those categories. So from this, we could conclude that the display of depression symptoms that meet that DSM criteria was associated with being more likely to report depression symptoms using a clinical screen. So what does this mean now if we turn our attention away from the profile owner and look at the adolescent viewers who are looking at the sites of their peers, who are thinking about the messages they're seeing? What do these messages mean to them? We've done one study with younger teens, and we asked them, what do you think it means? What does it mean to you when you see references to alcohol on Facebook or MySpace? And a couple representative quotes. One is, this teen told us, if a guy puts alcohol in his MySpace, you really can't say that it isn't true. And another teen told us, I don't think that we should post this stuff on Facebook because it could get younger teens to drink. We asked similar questions with a slightly older population about depression references. What did those mean? What do you think when you see your peers display these? And one student said, I think people use Facebook to say things like that they are depressed, that they can't say in person. And one of my favorite and yet least favorite quotes that we've ever collected is this one that states, it's like this little tiny cry for help that no one will probably respond to. So I hope what I've shown you is that displayed references to intoxication and problem drinking are associated with scoring into the problem alcohol use category. Displayed references to depression symptoms are associated with reporting depression symptoms on a clinical scale. And these references are considered believable by adolescents' peers. So I think it's possible that this could set up a cycle where people who display or people who view their influence, then they become people who engage in these behaviors, then they display, and that may also influence others. So what can we do? What is our role as pediatricians? I think a couple opportunities to consider are that social networking sites offer this new way to investigate and understand adolescent health behavior. And they may offer a new venue for us in the public health and pediatric world to promote healthy messages back within this venue. Some of the considerations that we've had with what to do with this information, are there other ways we can consider using this information to investigate health behaviors? And one suggestion that's been made to our research team is to consider training peer leaders within schools or within different communities to recognize symptoms of depression or cries for help or concerns on these profiles and be able to approach or interact with the people who display these behaviors. We've had discussions about whether this could be screening, provide opportunities for screening at a more population level. I think that's a more controversial idea and something that we'll need to do some more thinking about. In the intervention world, I think we can consider whether there are places where we as pediatricians can provide feedback and messages to adolescents using these media tools. And one thing to consider is that all advertisements on Facebook are targeted and triggered by keywords on the profile. So you can imagine if you were a college health service, you could consider advertising your counseling center triggered by keywords linked to depression by your students on their profiles. You could consider whether or not a reference to intoxication or problem drinking would trigger some sort of health message or public service announcement that would go then to be displayed when that profile owner put in that type of message on their own profile. Clearly, there's a lot more work that we need to do and a lot of opportunities we haven't considered. So I think I'll wrap up at this point, and I'm happy to take your questions.